Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tesi Rusagara. I'm the Managing Director of Kigali Innovation City. So our mission is to nurture the innovation and technology ecosystem here in Rwanda and really build an economy that's driven by innovation going forward. So we're building a technology park that's about 60 hectares, that's anchored by 4 universities, and we'll be developing it into a mixed-use park. So I can share more information about that, but briefly, that I think that I can hand over to Kofi now for his introduction. Kofi, I hope your mic is working now.
Well, as we wait for Kofi, I think we can give him the chance to introduce himself while the panel is ongoing, and he will just hop onto into his question with his introduction. Yeah, so I think we can dive straight into the panel session with the first question going to Tesi. So Tesi, thanks for telling us a little bit about KIC's role as an enabler and tasked with accelerating Rwanda's innovation ecosystem. And the role innovation plays in urbanizing cities can't be overemphasized, especially with the times that we're in with COVID-19, and the role innovation has played to curb the spread of the virus. And looking at the core mandate of the Kigali Innovation City, how far are you with this mandate, and how can innovators across the continent benefit from Rwanda setting up an innovation city?
Thank you, Patrick. So I think, first of all, we see ourselves as an ecosystem enabler and builder. So with 2 mandates. The first one is more providing the physical infrastructure for innovation. And in terms there, as I'd mentioned, we're anchored by 4 universities, 2 of which are already operational. So Carnegie Mellon and African Leadership University, Africa. And the other 2 are under construction or in pre-construction. So the first, KIC is really built upon that talent pool and developing that talent pool. It's a very pan-African talent pool. I think as of last year, our count was we had about 35 African countries represented. So usually most of these schools, 50% of the student population is Rwandan, and then 50% is the rest of Africa. So it's really diverse, which is very important when you start to think about innovation, when you start to think about entrepreneurship. And many of them actually then stay on in Rwanda and find jobs or start businesses together, usually very Pan-African businesses, because they benefit from the kind of diversity that they have in their class. So that's one way that I think KIC is contributing to the broader continent in terms of educating a wide pool, but also providing a platform even when they graduate for them to actually stay in Rwanda, start their businesses, but also think Pan-African more broadly. For the rest of the site, we've also partnered with Africa 50, which is a Pan-African investment platform. So we're building that into a mixed-use site with commercial space, housing, residential, so that beyond just the universities, we're creating a clear pathway to, once you graduate, there's the infrastructure there for your startup, for your business, for companies that will hire you or give you internships while you're at school. So it's to try and create a flow and a path for the students, but also for startups and for companies to, especially tech companies, to be able to tap into that talent pool that we're building. Our goal is to be a platform for any startup. So whether you're from any African country, you can Rwanda has very friendly policies, and it's very easy to do business here. So it's really a platform for everyone to benefit. We're also equally working with the government and the existing private sector chamber, which focuses on tech development, to focus also on the softer aspects. So making sure we have the right soft infrastructure in terms of policies. We have an ongoing reform for the Startup Act to create an enabling environment, but also looking at financing, talent development, and so on. So it's a very holistic approach to building the ecosystem, and for Africa.
Right. Thanks, Tesi, for that. And I think I'll get back to you with the Startup Act. But one thing that kept, repeating was the Pan-African, from the partnership with Africa 50 to the talent pool that is coming from the universities that are hosted at the city. And just quickly, I wanted to loop in Emmanuel. So Emmanuel, I mean, currently 600 of the biggest urban areas already account for 60% of global GDP. And when you look at this number, it's only going to go higher. Could you tell us more about the work that Utopia Lagos is doing and how you're supporting entrepreneurs to anticipate and solve the challenges that African cities will have? And it's a very interesting one because Tesi touched a lot on the Pan-African talent pool, and I think you're doing the same in that regard. So could you share with us?
Right.
Sure. So Emmanuel, did you hear my question?
Yes, I did. I
think maybe we can all mute our mics as Emmanuel.
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting to actually hear Tesi share, because I was at the AIF last year, and it's just exciting to see that sort of partnership start to then even expand the work of the Kigali Innovation City. That's the one with Africa 50. But going to the work that we do, I think for me, where I like to start these conversations is to first of all ground this in, I guess, the reality of what we have to deal with, right? A lot of times I think it's important to first of all, I guess, share how much urbanization is a big deal in Africa, right? Personally, I think it's probably Africa's biggest opportunity over the coming decades. And it's literally one of the very few mega trends that we're seeing. And a few statistics that I'll share. I mean, right now, we know that 2/3 of our cities are yet to be built, right? We know that African cities, a lot of African cities are growing at, I think the average across sub-Saharan Africa is 4.1%, whereas the global average is 2%. So we're growing at over double the global average, right? We know that between 2018 and I think 2050, our urban population is almost going to triple, right? We know that, and we also know that by the end of this century, for instance, 13 of the largest megacities out of the top 20 would be in Africa. I can go on and share more statistics, but the reality is that urbanization. Yes, we can hear from Kofi now. Anyway, we know that urbanization is a big deal, but what we don't see enough of is the fact that, I mean, think about Lagos, for instance, think about other African cities. Would be, I think data shows that Lagos would be, 88 million by the end of the century. What I think we don't see enough of is the fact that entrepreneurs are going to play a huge role in shaping what all of this looks like. Granted, a lot of it rests in the hands of government, but the reality is that the scale of what we have to deal with, government alone can't manage that, or government alone can't sustain that. And entrepreneurs are going to play a significant role in shaping all of that. So for us at Utopia, we see our role as helping to create that platform for what we call urban entrepreneurs to thrive. Obviously in partnership with governments, in partnership with corporate stakeholders, in partnership with universities and the likes, essentially creating that ecosystem that enables entrepreneurs who we believe have the best shots at shaping how our cities evolve, essentially creating that ecosystem for them to thrive. And in Lagos specifically, I mean, we launched in Africa late last year. We've been in existence since 2016, and we have city labs in Rio, in Kathmandu right now, but we also have our offices in Rio, and then we have a hub in Silicon Valley. But we launched late last year in Africa, and since then, I mean, we are now working with a cohort of 8 startups through what is perhaps Africa's first Urban Accelerator program. And really the goal is, how can we enable startups who are building specifically for the urban context? How can we help them scale? How can we provide, what sorts of support can we provide? And we think of that as a first step to launching our city labs, which are urban venture studios for entrepreneurs to try. There are a few more things that we're doing towards like launching the and things like that. But for us, the core goal is, we know that entrepreneurs, especially in the urban context, it's difficult working with all of the stakeholders in that space. How can we be the platform that's helping to organize that? And how can we be the platform that's helping to essentially create the ecosystem for entrepreneurs to try?
Right. Thank you so much, Emmanuel. And Kofi, welcome back. We are asking that you will introduce yourself while you answer the question, but I'll go ahead and ask you as well so that you combine all that. Sure. Emmanuel said something very interesting. 2/3 of African cities are yet to be built. And that's a very unique opportunity for us to leapfrog the traditional architecture, as I spoke about. With your with your current portfolio, one being part of the team that designed the National Cathedral of Accra, quite an iconic building. Congratulations on that. Could you just take us through? What are some of the trends that you're seeing on the continent in the architectural space, as well as how you believe we could leapfrog, the traditional architecture to be able to tackle the challenges of future cities?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Kofi. I'm the Associate Principal of Adjaye Associates. I'm based here in Accra, and I'm responsible for our projects on the African continent. Adjaye Associates was established by our founder, Sir David Adjaye, in the year 2000. And over the years, we've been working on various projects from civic, cultural, through to residential, healthcare, and education, and sort of a raft of projects over the period. Now, I guess to go straight into your question, Patrick, what we believe as a practice really is about sort of promoting architecture that is not just a case of building structures within cities, but actually creating a response that creates a way of life. So of course we can bring all the experience from around the world, but I think once you're operating on our continent, you have to work with the context. And so our architectural response is not a case of just sort of tagging on sustainable resources or any of those things, but actually it's really about how we respond to the context using the design, and if that's down to the materiality, that's down to how we actually build and construct with local materials. And I think what we really believe in is actually, we call it bursting the construction bubbles, really, and almost kind of just really kind of changing the narrative about using local supply chains. And that what we've done over the years really is to sort of start to sort of research into the traditional materials that we've had with us for centuries. So the traditional earth, laterite, for instance, something that we've been using in construction for a very, very long time on the continent. But of course, you know, in recent years, we've sort of become dependent on sandcrete and sort of other unsustainable methods of construction. And so really it's about almost going back to basics and kind of using the science, the opportunity of science that we have now to improve the way of construction. That's one element, but also to kind of create cities that we can sort of operate in, you know. So now, you know, you find in most of our African cities, there's a lot of young people that are sort of, you know, I'm a keen cyclist myself, and you sort of find that, you know, within the urban context, there isn't actually the infrastructure to sort of support some of these things. So it's really about using architecture to actually create spaces and places in order for people to sort of, you know, feel proud in the context of where they live and where they operate. And I guess on a practical sense, it almost becomes a social contract between the population, the government, and also the private sector, really to kind of create an environment for us to coexist.
Patrick, you're on mute.
Thanks for that, Tesi. Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, so thank you so much for that, Kofi. I think I'll come back to you on the social contract between you know, the government and its people towards the end. But let me just jump straight to Emmanuel and just dive straight into funding, which is one of the, you know, biggest components when it comes to building most of these solutions and features that we are discussing today. I know Utopia Lagos has set up a fund, the Mega City Fund. Could you tell us more about that, and especially how you believe that this funding could curb, you know, the growing inequality among the population in these urban cities across the continent?
Thanks for that. So I guess a lot of the philosophy and a lot of the thinking behind the Megacity Fund is also grounded in a lot of what I shared earlier. The reality is that today, right, there's not enough funding that goes into like infrastructure building in Africa. There's, I think according to World Bank, 100 billion yearly infrastructure gap, for instance. And then we also know that specifically 2/3 of what is needed for Africa's urban infrastructure till 2050 doesn't exist yet, right? So there's like a 2/3 gap, even specifically for urban infrastructure. And for us, if you look globally, for instance, you see urban startups like Uber, Airbnb, and the likes raising significant funding globally, right? And there are platforms like Sidewalk Labs, UrbanX in North America that's focused on specifically like shaping and supporting innovation in the urban context. But the reality is that if you look around in Africa, it's quite difficult to find those sort of platforms. So for us, the thinking behind the Megacity Fund is simple. How can we help channel significant funding into urban innovators? I mean, the goal for us is to start with early stage startups and innovations, but really the big picture is some of that would then eventually feed into like large urban infrastructure projects, because the reality is that if we don't attract enough funding for innovation or in shaping that, then that inequality that you speak about, which is already glaring. I mean, right now, 50% of our urban population live in slums, right? And the data shows that is, a lot of the growth that we're going to see in our urban growth across Africa would likely happen in slums. If no one is specifically investing in saying that what needs to be done to improve quality of life, what needs to be done from an infrastructure standpoint for a lot of these people. We know that people are going to live in cities, and we know that right now they're already living in slums, right? What needs to be done to essentially stem that tide? It's through initiatives like the Megacity Fund and a lot of other infrastructure projects funding that we're seeing. And for us, that's our attempt to try to, I guess, stem that inequality, because otherwise a lot of these statistics that are reeled out would then become a reality. But we want to try to shift that narrative in such a way that our cities can be made to work for a lot of people. And was focused, and I think one thing that's core to us that I would like to highlight as well in our work with Utopia is that we think of the city as a whole, right? Whether that's the formal and informal sector, whether that's slums or, all of the formal built-up areas, because the reality is that we believe that cities are made for people, and everyone, globally, cities are meant to, people move to cities in order to be able to access better quality of life and things like that. But we also know that right here in Africa, that isn't exactly true. A lot of the data suggests that the urbanization that we're experiencing in Africa doesn't necessarily correlate with growth in terms of economic potential for people moving into cities. How can we change that? I think that's really the thinking behind a lot of our work, and more specifically to your question, the Africa Megacity Fund as well.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for that. And in that same regard with funding, Tesi, could you share with us how Kigali Innovation City is being funded? And along with funding, put in place to ensure that the Kigali Innovation City is a success to the magnitude that we all expect it to be.
Sure, Patrick. And maybe I'll start by saying, Emmanuel, you're welcome to start Utopia Kigali. We'd welcome you.
Sure.
But
we'll chat after this.
Yes. So for the real estate, it's a public-private partnership. So between the government and Africa 50, especially for the project development activities. So the very early stage, determining getting the master plan, figuring out the commercial viability, figuring out the strategy. A lot of that work is through setting out the infrastructure, at least the horizontal infrastructure is through a PPP, and then that creates an environment for other private investors to come and plug into existing infrastructure into a plan, and then work with us to build out the rest of the city. And I think, just more broadly for infrastructure projects on the continent, and as we think about urbanization, it's increasingly, not one party can do it alone. There's usually roles and responsibilities and risks that have to be shared, both by the public sector, by the private sector, also your eventual customers. So something we did even before we started the master planning process was to interview our potential clients and tenants. So those who we knew were existing, like the students, but then also talk to tech companies, startups, understand what kind of environment do you want to be in to be successful, so that could go into the master planning process. And then we also come back to them at different points to, through the stages, to make sure that where the design is, we're still getting their input. It still aligns with sort of their development plans, because that's also evolving. So we, to some extent, making sure we include our potential tenants, but also our current tenants who are there. So I think that's how it's being funded. One is for the early, very high risk activities. Those are being shared between the government and Africa 50, and then later on bringing in more private sector players once you've de-risked parts of the project. In terms of the second question you asked around how do you create a conducive environment so it's successful. It's very important because, one, you need to minimize the demand risk for the site itself, for the real estate, but two, this is supposed to be supporting infrastructure for an overall ecosystem that we're building to drive economic growth, to address most of these challenges that we're facing on the continent that we've been speaking about in terms of healthcare and so on. So there we're the one right now, we're currently looking at the Startup Act as one of a very key reform process that will happen. I think you look at a lot of laws and regulations that exist on the continent today were done at a time when you didn't have the kind of startups that we're seeing emerge that will drive growth. So when you look at even our company laws and how they deal with equity to employees or different kinds of classes of shares, you find that many countries might not have the policy and legal infrastructure to support the kind of startups that we want to see grow. So it's, making sure that we can also, I guess, update the laws and regulations that exist to facilitate that, to facilitate access to markets, to facilitate capital flows, to facilitate talent development, and so on. So that's one key thing. I think a second thing is just to look at also strategic partnerships with people, so that we're, the universities was one great example in terms of partnering with people who can deliver world-class education. So continuing to do that. We're also promoting, I think one thing that is really great about Rwanda is that it's a great testing bed, and we constantly see ourselves as a testing bed for innovation. There's openness from the government. Oftentimes the government is even willing to be the first mover and customer. So I think that also provides a great platform and for innovation that encourages startups to come in, to form, but also to be successful and scale. So there's a couple of different initiatives, but all of it is to look at both the physical and also the outside ecosystem infrastructure that's required to make sure that we're building up that tenant pool, I guess, as well.
Patrick, do you mind if I jump in and just make a few comments based off of what Tesi just said?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that since we're talking about the city of the future, I just wanted to make a comment that personally, I think that Kigali and Rwanda's model could actually become sort of a model for other cities on the continent to follow. And the reason why I say that is when you look at Kigali Innovation City, for instance, we see cities across Africa. There's almost this obsession with like creating like cities, standalone cities by themselves, right? But that needs to be done within the context of a lot more things, right? And I struggle with that concept a lot when people say, oh, we're building this innovation city somewhere. But I think that for Kigali, it's very different because there is a lot, like it's a component of a lot of other things. So when you look at the Startup Act, for instance, when you look at the Kigali City Master Plan, you know that like they've thought through a lot of the different pieces, and the Innovation City is one important component in that. But what we see across Africa is that people just take one component of that and say they're spending 100 million, 200 million on some smart city projects, which is out in the middle of nowhere, that's almost destined to fail. And I think that that's something that I struggle with personally, just like looking at a lot of these projects across Africa. But I'm really, really excited about Kigali, just because like you can, I mean, it's easy to see how everything fits, right? Like it's an entire ecosystem to say, hey, on the one hand, there's the Startup Act that's focused on essentially enabling, making the business climate more friendly for startups to succeed, and startups play a key role in that. There's the master plan, for instance, that then takes a long-range view of the city, which a lot of cities don't also do, right? To then say, hey, what could Kigali look like in 2050, for instance, right? And then what do we need to start doing today to get us to that point? How do we address a lot of the key issues that are important to people? I think that that's the sort of thinking that's required for cities across Africa to thrive, especially from a government standpoint, right? And then when you then place Kigali Innovation City in that context, it starts to make a lot of sense, because you're then saying that, hey, we're going to need research capacity, we're going to need a test bed for a lot of these things to happen. How can we then build up that talent pool to make that happen? I think that that's, I mean, I'm fascinated by that, just to put it out there, but I think that that's how we should think about like shaping our cities in the future, and not just taking the individual components of it. I just wanted to put it out there.
I think also I'll tag on to that, because I think this probably leads on to, I can imagine the next question that's coming from you, Patrick, but just tagging on to Tesi and Emmanuel, I think that makes this is essentially what I meant about the whole idea about the social contract, because essentially what we have, the infrastructure in most sort of African cities that we have now have been inherited from colonial times. And of course, they have been improved on over the years, but we're almost at that trajectory whereby we're moving on to sort of the next level or to the next stage. And, and Emmanuel sort of went through sort of the statistics on sort of the growth on the continent. But essentially, what actually needs to happen in order for kind of some of these cities to be able to respond to the to the rapid growth over this period, it's really about the sort of governments being able to sort of be the anchor to kind of provide the right avenue, provide the right sort of whether it's incentives or the right channels then for the private sector to then be able to come into that space and say, okay, we're going to transform the center of Accra, we're going to transform the center of Lagos or Kigali. And actually, from our point of view, from Adjaye Associates, sort of with the architectural response, we give an architectural response that then responds to the context. And essentially what that does then is then creates a space or makes a place that the Ghanaian or the Nigerian or the Rwandan or the South African or the Kenyan is actually proud to thrive in that space, because they have a place or a space has been created for them that they're actually proud to kind of call theirs. And that kind of helps to then deal with some of these issues that of course we tend to find in some of our cities, in relation to sort of drainage systems, pollutions, which half of them, when you start to go down to the whole issue about plastics, and Tesi in Rwanda, I know you've managed to sort of curb that, which is amazing. And I think we all sort of look to that, but essentially it's these kind of problems that create or these kind of or resolutions between government policy to private sector involvement or private sector championing, and then really the population then sort of jumping onto that and creating that contract in order to kind of elevate the status of a city. And I think that beautifully sort of what we do as Adjaye Associates to kind of create some of these spaces for the populace.
Right. Thanks a lot, Kofi, for diving in, and Emmanuel for the interjection as well. I think Tesi asked the question at the beginning, welcoming Emmanuel and Kofi to Kigali Innovation City, and I guess Tesi have your answer. So we should start all arrangements for the two entrepreneurs that are joining Kigali Innovation City. So just to remind the audience that you can write to the panelists on our chat, and we will just be opening it up to questions, to our three panelists. So I just want to touch on two quick subjects before we dive into questions from the audience. And so I would just like all the three panelists to just highlight two of the key challenges or obstacles that need to be overcome for the future cities to become a reality. I know Emmanuel talked about one while talking about the beauty of the Kigali Innovation City. So we could hear from Tesi and Kofi.
I think the first one would be funding, especially funding for hard long-term problems. You see a lot of the funding that comes to the continent, and it's changing, but there's still private capital is chasing, quicker returns. So I think that when we start to think about how we can, one, activate local capital for and divert that, especially private capital, to both our entrepreneurs, but also to some of these larger infrastructure projects. And of course, there's a role in de-risking them and so on, but then also getting outside capital to support that. I think that will be very important. If you look at even in the aftermath of COVID, a lot of people have realized that neglecting health systems in many places has now come back to, have a really negative impact on many countries. So I as we look to the rate of urbanization, and we know that brings both opportunities and challenges, making sure that we're dedicating enough time in terms of planning, funding, and thinking through how we can support some of these long-term challenges. You know, tomorrow it might be water and so on, like sanitation. We really need to be thinking about them.
Right.
Yeah, maybe someone else can chime in, but and then
sure. So Kofi, yeah. Thank you, Tesi.
I think with the way our cities are growing and sort of the urban sprawl, we really need to kind of, you know, the challenges that we see is really about improving the housing systems, the transportation systems, and also I think drainage also is kind of really key. And these might seem really, you know, sort of basic, but I think they are fundamental to actually growing a city and supporting sort of the growth that we've all talked about in this session about, you know, how we expect our cities to sort of sprawl over the next sort of 40 years. And I think once these are addressed, and actually it's not even about once they're addressed, but I think it's the manner in which they're addressed that will then ensure the kind of sustainable development of our cities. And they're real challenges. And I think in all sort of, you know, our various cities, the three of us where we are, and across the continent, these are real challenges that I think if, you know, if they're handled sort of in a very innovative and sustainable way, will kind of really help kind of, you know, sustain our cities for the next few centuries.
Right. So, as we still, yes, Emmanuel, you wanted to.
Yeah, I guess just to add one quick point to that for me would be, I guess, to also maybe just pay attention. I think that one of the challenge is that we haven't paid enough attention to slums and informal settlements. I think that especially across Africa, we almost sort of think of slums as bugs, so to speak, to be squashed in that concept of mega cities and smart cities and things like that. But I think that we need to start paying a lot more attention to those spaces, because in that informality, there's so much to learn from there, right? There's so much resilience, there's so much, and if you actually observe a lot of those communities, you start to observe like certain patterns about how things operate that actually could be a way for us that we can learn from in thinking about like the general. So I think that for me, the key thing that I just wanted to point out there is that we need to also just like rethink how our relationships with informal communities in general.
I think that's very key. And so there's a question from Michelle. How intensely are renewable energies and technologies, including water recycling and sanitization/recycling, being considered? Is it at the forefront or still in early stages of understanding/consideration?
I think from an architectural point of view, and this is something that, you know, here at Adjaye Associates, you know, and we always look at this not just as almost like a tag on, and I think, you know, we've gone through the trend in the sort of last 5 years whereby, you know, you see buildings sprawling up and someone says, well, I've got solar cells on the roof and, you know, I've got these little things sort of tagged on and so my building is sustainable. But actually we believe that architecture and an architectural response or a design response to buildings and to the context, it's really about, you know, thinking about the materials. So, you know, right from day one, and to answer Michelle's question, actually, it's right from the early process. You're thinking about the materials you're using. You're thinking about the orientation of buildings. You're thinking about the context of your building and how to provide sort of shading, you know, the thermal performance of the buildings. Those are sort of things that actually create a sustainable environment, the landscape around you. So, you know, believe it or not, having trees and vegetation and natural landscape actually reduces the temperature of an environment or of an ecosystem by up to 6 degrees. So, you know, we believe in sort of creating these sustainable spaces whereby it's actually more about the well-being of people that live within that space. It's not just, okay, we've got a couple of blocks of apartments, or we've provided, you know, better accommodation in the slums and that's it. But actually, you're creating an ecosystem and a place for people to sort of, you know, live. And I think to answer Michelle's question directly, yes, it is at the forefront of everything that we do here, and it's something that David, you know, sort of champions in everything that he does in terms of our design response in all our buildings, from master planning, you know, all the way through to sort of individual dwellings.
Yeah. Yeah, and
That's
maybe
exciting.
to
Tesi, you seem to agree.
To just complement Kofi, because we're in the process. So from three perspectives. One is from the perspective of developing a new site. It's been within the master planning process, making provisions for green space, for recycling, for renewable energies where it makes sense. So that's something that we're doing upfront of the design process. Then we also have some of our tenants who've constructed and have, used natural, local materials, have really thought about what that means in terms of temperature control, building orientation, and so on. So I think there's, like Kofi said, there's also a very big design aspect in terms of what the decisions you make very upfront can influence, can actually reduce your footprint in terms later on. And then just the third stage is when I look at the city of Kigali more broadly. We've been having a couple of startups who are coming in the electric mobility space, looking at the motorcycles. I know most African countries, there's a lot of motors that are the most common form of transport. How do those go electric? Looking at electric bikes. So it's also changing that transportation more broadly within the city, and that, because that's also a very big source of pollution.
Right. Thank you so much, Kofi and Tesi. And this for me is very exciting because, the former sustainability concepts have all been based on limiting damage in the environment. But the Paris Agreement and the UN SDGs entirely focus on, having positive impact on both human health and the environment. And it's exciting that all those considerations are being put in action, especially in some of the projects that we are actually seeing going live right now. And so if we have no other question, I would also just want to pose to Emmanuel. What's your assessment of the talent and the skills that are needed for Africans to build the cities of the future that are actually African designed, conceptualized, and solving African problems?
Right. For me, I think that talent, if anything, is Africa's biggest, like, I can't emphasize it enough, opportunity, right? I think that we have the talent here, right, to be able to build the things that we need. I mean, looking at our youth population, for instance, we have the youngest population in the world. We probably have the most entrepreneurial population as well. And there's just so much innovation, and there's so much, and we're already seeing a lot of people build very innovative solutions. So I don't think it's a talent question. I think it's more of an enabling environment question. And I think that that's where the real work is. From a talent standpoint, I think that Africans are brilliant. Africans can build, and Africans will build our future. But I think that a lot more then needs to be done in creating the environment for these talents to try, right? To harness that talent and essentially nurture that so that we are maximizing it. So I think that that's the real question. But from a talent standpoint, I think that we do have a massive talent pool.
Right. So we will be getting to the conclusion, but there's something that I also wanted us to talk about just before this, and that's data protection and privacy. Tesi, would you like to touch on that?
Sure, Patrick. The specific question?
Well, I mean, it's a hot subject. This year, we've seen a lot of contact tracing going on. Various solutions that we are looking at, from smart health to smart transport, really rely on a lot of data collected by private companies, which is a role that has previously been taken on by government, which gives a certain level of comfort. Yeah. And so there is a lot of focus that should be put around protecting people's data and privacy amidst the growing need for solutions like this. And what is KIC's thought on this? Are you working with different institutions that are in charge of, or that are mandated with this, to ensure that, you know, while we're moving at a fast pace with different innovations, at the same time we are protecting their users.
Yeah, so it's something that, you know, at least in Rwanda, where currently the process is ongoing to review the data privacy and protection law and update it, and, you know, find the balance between protection of, you know, the people who are providing the data, especially citizens, but also encouraging innovation. And I think, you know, some of the principles that at least where there seems to be alignment on is in terms of setting, you can't control who has data, and often we also give up, even as citizens, we give up the data very easily ourselves. But at least then setting, you know, minimum security, you know, guidelines and guardrails around that, and then also putting a lot more responsibility, I guess, on the people who are taking the data to meet certain standards. I think it's always going to continue to be a balancing act, because especially for younger startups, you don't want it to be too prohibitive where they also cannot grow and it's too costly for them to meet certain requirements. So it's something that's under discussion and under development, but I think what has been, the way the process has been done was to make sure that it's also very they're consulting different parties, and also looking at both benchmarking of global standards, not just GDPR, but also other jurisdictions which have been a lot more flexible than GDPR, but still kept in mind citizen privacy and also security. So it's a work in progress, but I think it will be in the right direction, at least in a direction that also supports innovation.
Right. Thank you so much, Tesi. So thank you all panelists for taking your time to lead this discussion, and of course the audience that joined us. So I would like everyone to just take 30 seconds with something to close this panel session. We can start with you, Kofi.
I think in summary, I mean, we've always sort of encouraged our clients to sort of be really resourceful and sort of mindful to the idea about sort of creating sustainable spaces and sustainable architecture and design. And I think that really is kind of key, not just for the long term, but also for the immediate. And so, as our cities grow and we sort of get into the future, we really need to think about creating responses that deal with our issues now, but also prepare us for the future, so that we don't find ourselves 50 years down the line where we've created something that's only going to last for 5 years. So I think, we need to think about sustainability in the now and the future.
Thanks, Kofi. Tesi?
No, I think maybe the last few things would be really thinking from the beginning about tech and how tech can help us when it comes to urbanization. There's really a lot of opportunities for the continent when it comes to thinking through both tech as an opportunity, but also to overcome anything from the infrastructure issues that we face to housing and so on. So I think I'm very excited about that. Maybe a second feature would just be making sure that there's also an African identity in our cities of the future. So Kofi, that one's for the design folks. I think there's really a lot of opportunity to make sure that our identity, whether it's our materials, whether it's the design, that our cities will also have something distinct about them that can, for many years to come, in 300 years, it's something that will stay and will be iconic. And I think that's a challenge for all of us.
Sure. Emmanuel?
Yes, I think I'll just latch on to Kofi and Tesi's point to say that the city of the future, or our cities, are meant to work for everyone, right? It means that the city of the future are going to be those cities that actually accurately reflect the culture, the desires of the people, the aspirations in such a way that everyone feels that, I mean, they can call the city their own. And in order for us to get to that point, I think that it will require everyone working together, whether that's entrepreneurs, whether that's governments, whether that's corporate, civil society organizations. How can everyone, I mean, architects, designers, everyone, right? And how can we work together? What I would like to see is a world where we're all working together to build the cities that actually reflect what we want to see and that works for everyone, not just a section of the city.
Right. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, Tesi, and Kofi. And again, thank you so much from our audience. And we've come to the end of this panel. God bless you all, and hope to see you soon through various discussions that we'll be having. And again, Kofi and Emmanuel, the Rwandan invite awaits. Bye for now.
And Patrick is also an innovator in smart transportation, so you should invite him to your.
Oh, sure, yes. Accra and Lagos, please. We need to launch our solutions there. Look forward to.
Yeah, please, you're welcome. And yes, Tesi, I'll take you up on the offer. Yes. And maybe Kofi as well.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, take care, everyone.
Have a good evening.
You too. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.